Welcome to this field-specific training module for researchers in the College of Agriculture. Purdue University and the College of Agriculture are committed to the highest standards of research integrity and responsible conduct in research. To ensure that all researchers at Purdue are trained to conduct research in an informed and responsible manner, Purdue University has adopted a new responsible conduct of research standard effective July 1st, 2020. The standard applies to all faculty, staff, graduate, and undergraduate students of the university who design and conduct research and/or report and publish research outcomes. Training on responsible conduct and research, or RCR topics, includes authorship, mentoring, peer review, conflicts of interest, plagiarism, data management, and reproducibility of research results. It has two components: general online RCR training offered through the CITY program, and field-specific RCR training. The two components are complementary, with the online CITY training providing basic information. The field-specific training provides an opportunity to learn more about RCR issues, to ask questions, and to discuss with colleagues in a discipline-specific context. Both components are required by several funding agencies, and both are required at Purdue. This video meets part of the 2-hour field-specific training for researchers in the College of Agriculture. Please be aware that it is your responsibility to document your own training through the website portal managed by the EBPRP office and referenced within this presentation. So there's 3 things that we're going to accomplish today. One is we're going to go through an overview of responsible conduct and research and some of the common areas of concern. There'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. And then the third thing is that we'll share with you how to complete documentation of field-specific RCR training. I'm going to encourage you to use the chat function in Zoom. I will monitor the chat, and as we hear from our experts in this area, I'll interject your questions to our experts. I'm also, just to let you know, we're recording this session, so we can make it available at a later time if you want to review it, or to those individuals that are not able to be present with us this afternoon. Okay, so just a couple of housekeeping items there. Our subject matter experts today are 2. One is Jamie Moeller. He's a professor of computer graphics, and he's associate dean of the graduate school, and he is the research integrity officer for Purdue University. Jamie's led a research program at Purdue. He's taught several courses at Purdue, and among them is the course called Grad 612, which is responsible conduct and research. So he has dealt with many aspects of RCR in the past with students in particular. He's been instrumental in helping many of the colleges across the university with info sessions like this one on field-specific RCR training. With us as well is Dr. Bob Pruitt. He's a professor of botany and plant pathology in the College of Agriculture, where his research focuses on the nature of bacterial interactions with plants, in particular those that are human pathogens and how they may contaminate fresh produce. Bob has also taught Grad 612 on many occasions, and he serves as a resource to faculty and students in the RCR area. I also want to recognize Dr. Sean Courtney, who's the Research Compliance Manager for Purdue University in the Office of the Executive Vice President for Research and Partnerships. And Sean's primary responsibility, and there he is waving, his primary responsibility includes directing research compliance and field-specific training. His job is to ensure that all researchers comply with responsible conduct of research regulations for federal, state, local, and university levels. So with that, I welcome those individuals with us today. I'm going to turn the floor over to, or the Zoom, over to Jamie, who will lead us through some information on some of the areas of concern, common areas of concern that we need to be aware of. And again, I encourage you to Get your questions answered, put them in the chat, and we'll interject them as we go through this session over the next period of time. So Jamie, it's yours. You should have the ability to share your screen and so on.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Jamie Moeller, and glad to be able to come to you. And I do want to give credit. Many of you know the longstanding faculty member named Pete Dunn. Much of this material I inherited from him. I owe a debt of gratitude to him and a lot of these materials. So I'm going to basically present in this mode. If you will, if in your screen, if you go to the view and to view, which should be up in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, and select on speaker view, you'll be able to see me as well as my slides. I kind of prefer doing it that way as opposed to doing a share screen in which, a lot of people may or may not be able to see me as well as the slides. I just think it makes it a little more interesting. So I've kind of distilled this down into what I think are the most important kind of points, and really just kind of hitting the high points of things that as I go across the university and talk about RCR and the things that I think are most important is here. And I'll say there are at least two things here that are probably not in the city module that you would have already viewed, and that would be detrimental research practices and undue foreign influence. So I will touch on those things as well. So as it relates to research misconduct as the Rio at Purdue, this is kind of one of the main things that I have to address or deal with. I will say that research misconduct is very narrowly defined by three specific things. There are several integrity issues that are research integrity issues, but they don't fall directly into research misconduct. And that's really where you kind of get over into detrimental research practices. This is a pretty dense slide, but it pretty much has everything you need to know about what is defined as research misconduct and Purdue's policy. Our policy is aligned with federal research misconduct policy, and as that shifts and changes, although it's not, I will say it's quite possible that it's going to shift to some degree in the upcoming years, given some of the newer topics, but nevertheless, we're basically in line with that. But research misconduct is comprised of three specific things. That is fabrication, creating fake data; falsification, taking data and making it say something that it doesn't; or on the other side of it, doing things like p-hacking and data dredging, where you're trying to actually find results with no particular hypothesis at the outset. And then lastly would be plagiarism, that is the pilfering of other people's ideas or words without attribution. So narrowly defined, there are a lot of integrity issues that can fall outside of those things. We'll get into that, but so that's the first thing. And I'm just going to abbreviate it as FFP just because it makes it easier. Second would be it's in any aspect of the research record. And that's really what the federal policy is focused on, is trying to maintain the research record, make sure it doesn't become corrupt, because regardless of what area we all do research in, we're all building on the work of others. And obviously, if one piece of research ends up being found to be misconduct, it's kind of like pulling a thread on a tapestry. The whole thing just unravels, and you can imagine how difficult it is to retract articles and to unwind all that. So it's really focused on research record. And the research record is anything, the obvious of conference and journals and those kinds of things, but it also covers proposals that we might submit for our graduate students. That's versions of their theses and dissertations. It can also cover, even the smallest of research reports you might ask your graduate students to conduct. Maybe it's a one-pager, but the rule applies regardless of where in the research record it appears. Now, the exception to this is where's the point at which it changes over from research misconduct to academic misconduct. And an example of this would be preliminary examinations. Depending on how you do prelims, if the prelim is like a test, an exam, then it's academic. If it is like the beginnings of a research proposal and kind of, or the presentation of something that's going to be submitted as a grant, all right, then it's research record. So there is some gray in there. But nevertheless, it's all aspects of the research record. And for it to be considered research misconduct, it has to adhere to the following three things. First of all, it has to be a significant departure from the accepted practices in the relevant research community. And each research community has different practices. So what one community may perceive in one way, another might perceive in another. For example, I know in agriculture, and I don't know how many disciplines, but I know in agriculture, there are several disciplines in which the dissertation is comprised of articles that have been published previously. Essentially, the dissertation becomes a byproduct and the articles are the product, right? So chapters 2 through N are typically articles that the student has published. You have a front end chapter and you have a back end chapter to say where it's all going, wrap it together. That practice is standard in a lot of fields in agronomy and maybe a lot of, or excuse me, in agriculture, maybe a lot of other places too. But I'll say it was, it's not standard practice in my field coming from computer graphics. Now that is changing, but that's where you have to look at accepted practice. Second, it has to be, and this is probably the hardest thing when a research misconduct allegation comes forward, is for the faculty that are actually serving on the investigation committee to kind of come up with, okay, what was the state of mind of the individual? And most, all of our legal system is based on state of mind. And as it relates to research misconduct, which is a quasi-legal process, essentially the committee has to determine, okay, was it honest error? Because if it was honest error, then the person is going to be exonerated. It will not be research misconduct. But it only has to rise to a level of reckless or knowing and intentional. I see it as I view it as kind of a continuum, right? So honest error on one end, reckless in the middle, and knowing and intentional on the other end. And there are legal different definitions for all those I won't dive into, but key is it only needs to rise to the reckless level. And honest error is on the individual. So this is where, data management practices and keeping copious records, meticulous records even, is critically important, because that usually is the thing that can bear out a claim of honest error. And then the last one is that the allegation has to be proven by a preponderance of the evidence. It's not a beyond the shadow of a doubt kind of thing. It's just, does the majority of the evidence point this direction? So it has to, for it to be research misconduct, it has to be FFP somewhere in the research record that meets those things. I will go on to say that the policy says that it does not include differences. So research misconduct is not differences of opinion. And it's also not just plain being wrong. And so those things are not misconduct. So this one slide kind of, to me, succinctly communicates what kind of creates or what defines research misconduct, which leads to the question of, okay, there are other integrity issues. What does not classify as research misconduct? So first and foremost, and what comes to me a lot, are authorship issues. Authorship issues are actually called out in the federal policy specifically as not being research misconduct. Now, there can be integrity issues if somebody publishes out from underneath the other person, doesn't include someone or includes someone they shouldn't. Those are integrity issues, but they're not research misconduct issues. And you can see the list of other things here. I'm not going to read through them all. We are going to jump into detrimental research practices, because I don't think there's a lot of conversation around that particular one. But many of these other things here in the middle obviously go to other places. Like if you're talking about human and animal research subjects, that's obviously an IRB or a Keokuk issue or an LAP issue, whatever. But these are the kinds of things that don't fall in that bucket. Oftentimes they come to me and then I field them off to wherever they need to go. So the process, most people are not familiar with the process. And some of you, oftentimes we as faculty get, tapped to be on these committees. But there is a due process to this, and there is a presumption of innocence. Confidentiality, I think, is even tighter than what we would even see around a P&T situation, because obviously if an allegation is brought against a faculty member and word gets out about it, and then the person's exonerated, you can imagine how damaging that would be to the individual. And the other kind of baseline assumption is that the respondent has the opportunity to respond to the allegations and, provide a defense. The process is basically fivefold. Initial assessment is done by me. When an allegation comes in, I basically look at it and say, okay, if it were true, would it be FFP? And is there enough evidence? Does it look like there are enough evidence, or can be gathered enough evidence to actually go to investigation? If I say yes to both of those, then a faculty inquiry committee comprised of 3 faculty essentially ask the same questions. And I look at it as kind of like a check on me to make sure that I'm doing my job, or analyzing it properly, doing the assessment properly. If the faculty committee, inquiry committee says, yes, it looks like it probably would be FFP if found true, and there is enough data, then it goes to the investigation committee. And this is where it really kind of is a deep dive. This is where a faculty committee truly dives into it. They do an interview of the respondent, of the complainant, any other witnesses. This is where any materials that have been sequestered in the early stages of the process are provided to the investigation committee, and they have access to all of that. They may also call in experts to look at stuff. So there is really nothing that they don't have access to or that they can't look into. That investigation committee basically drafts a report, and it's really an allegation by allegation report. The individual who's accused, the respondent, does have the opportunity to appeal. And once the appeal cycle is over, then sanctions are put together by the provost, who is the deciding official, as the legal language, and then also the involved dean. So oftentimes department heads, associate deans, other folk are not brought into these conversations. It's probably better that way, because if there are other kinds of things working in parallel, like if somebody were going through promotion and tenure at the same time, I mean, you would not want that to be negatively used against them, or even it should not even be considered unless there were sanctions or whether the process was finished. But nevertheless, the provost, the deciding dean, myself, and legal counsel kind of work on the sanctions. And sanctions can be anywhere from just additional training to debarment, where you're not able to do something. It could be termination in the most extreme cases. For graduate students, that might mean anything from they could get expelled. It could be just training. I mean, I'm always hopeful that when we find it with graduate students, particularly, that we use it as an educational opportunity rather than a punitive opportunity. But that is up to the committee. That's up to the provost. That's up to the other folks. But those are kind of the range of things. Sean, I see you've unmiked for if there's a question or comment. Or
yeah, there's a question in the chat about self-plagiarism. A researcher not properly citing their own previous work or writing a paper that has a very marginal contribution over prior papers.
So first of all, self-plagiarism, we commonly use that term. Really what we're talking about is duplicity, that is getting credit twice for doing something once. There's a lot of variability here. There is a line somewhere, but the line varies depending on which field you're in. It's really, you have to look at what are the standard practices of that field and what would be professional judgment. My suggestion oftentimes when I talk to grad students, for example, is I just say, don't take any risks whatsoever. I mean, you don't want to be, self-plagiarism is not research misconduct, but it sure is sloppy research. It's sloppy scholarship, right? So it doesn't rise to the level of research misconduct in most cases when it is self-plagiarism. And my advice to graduate students always is separate, there are various practices. So a lot of times people will recycle text, pieces of text, if you will, like literature review or methodology that doesn't change from thing to thing. But you certainly are not, you're not actually recycling results, because they can only be original once. And those kinds of things. So there's gray in there. And the best thing I can suggest is particularly when you're working with graduate students, I think we as faculty kind of develop a professional sense of what's acceptable in our field, right? And where we can get ourselves in trouble is when we look at fields outside our own that might provide either tighter or looser, and we can't necessarily adopt that in our own. And the other is just providing graduate students and telling them, in the research realm, I would not advise doing it, particularly, until you get a real sense, and because there's some risk there, because people can see it as a negative. But the other side of that is absolutely in the classroom, never self-plagiarize in the classroom, because it can lead to dismissal from the university, because almost every professor I've ever met considers it cheating. Right. And so anytime I'm talking to grad students, that's something that I emphasize, is you have to separate the research context and what you might see done in a laboratory. And I will say there are some researchers who say any text recycling is plagiarism and should not be done. So there's a lot of gray here, but it's a great question, and one I think a lot of us struggle with or wrestle with. All right. So just some notes that I've observed. Most common research misconduct thing is plagiarism. So if I saw 20 cases in a year, half of those would be plagiarism. So that tells you how frequent it is. But the good thing is if there are 20 allegations in a year, at least half of the total would never go beyond the initial assessment phase, because it may have appeared to be research misconduct but wasn't, or a variety of reasons. But plagiarism is the most common. Second would be falsification of images, like Western blots and other types of scientific imagery where it's manipulated in some way. I think research misconduct is more common than we know. I don't think a lot of it, I think a lot of it goes unreported just because of the concerns, personal concerns being, what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to my research, what's going to happen to my relationship with my colleagues, blah, 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 if I report something that I've seen. The odds are that most people are going to see it. And so then it's knowing what to do. Long story short, basically the allegations come to me, and I would encourage not trying to handle them at the local level, mainly because our policy requires that they come to the research integrity officer and whoever's serving in that role. Because it's easy, if it were to go legal, essentially the easiest case for someone to win is a procedural error. And that's certainly true in this particular case. So I think that's my last slide in this particular. Let me just stop. And I know there was a question in the chat, but if there are any other questions, or Bob, I know Bob or Shawnee or if anybody else wants to contribute, certainly I'm not the only voice in the room.
If you've got questions on this section, please put them in the chat.
And if there's not, I can move on. I know time's precious, but I do want to stop and take a breath and make sure.
Okay. Question from on who should you contact if you notice data duplication in papers that are not from Purdue?
That's a great question. And actually I've had faculty reach out to me where they've noticed it other places, and certainly the research integrity officer at the other institution, or in some cases, it's a person who wears multiple hats. So usually there's some kind of research compliance. I can assist with that. If you ever notice it, if you notice something like that, I can get involved and try to help you hunt down who to report it to. It gets kind of tricky in that, like I had a faculty member who was serving as a reviewer on a journal, and they noticed such a thing in something they were reviewing. And so we were having a conversation about, what's the order of operations? The person feels like they have an obligation to report it to the journal, and they do, to the editor of the journal, but they also have a responsibility to the institution from which that person came. And so we talked about logistics of, an approach. So I can help. You don't necessarily have to come to me, but it would go to the RIO, the research integrity officer, or the compliance officer at whatever institution the person is at. And sometimes these things will actually domino, like once you find it at one institution, you trace it back. It's usually a habitual kind of thing. And so it may be multiple RIOs involved over time.
Okay. Well, anything else in the chat there?
Okay. Well, we'll move on then. So detrimental research practices. So what's a detrimental research practice? It's a practice of questionable integrity that does not rise to the level of research misconduct. These were kind of really crafted or honed out and really well defined by a document called Fostering Integrity in Research by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine back in 2017. I've put a link here. After this, I will actually provide Sean the PowerPoint. Or actually, I guess I did that beforehand, didn't I? But he can share that with you all. But essentially, DRPs fall into three categories: misrepresentation, breach of duty care, and improper dealing with allegations. And the first one, I'll dive into all three just to kind of give you an overview. If you really want to deep dive, I'd encourage you to take a look at the Fostering Integrity. And it is a free PDF. You can order a copy of it, but it costs money, but you can look at it as a PDF online. So misrepresentation, and some of these fall under DRP, but can very quickly and easily become research misconduct. For example, this first one, purposeful suppression or flawed interpretation. Depending on what's going on there, that could very easily move over into the category of research misconduct. Second would be, and actually back up and say, why are DRPs important? It's basically because if we look at cases of research misconduct that rise to that level, that are actual research misconduct, if you go back in history, almost always they're preceded by detrimental research practices. So there's even though correlation doesn't mean causation, there is a connection there. There is a relationship there, because when we look at cases, if you trace it back, you can actually see these small infractions of integrity that lead to bigger infractions of integrity is kind of what the idea. Undisclosed duplication of publication, and this is particularly pertaining to like results. So this could be publishing something twice in two different places, even concurrently. Failure to declare conflicts of interest, misrepresenting qualifications, experience, skills, positions, those kinds of things. And then the last one, which is the main reason that I talk about this, is relative to authorship. So misrepresentation of involvement in authoring situations. So to be an author, a person needs to materially participate in the research and materially participate in the writing, editing, drafting of the paper. to do both, right? Only doing one or the other really doesn't qualify an individual to be an author. Now, going no further, it's certainly gift, guest, or ghost authorship are integrity problems. So gift authorship, what I mean by that is where, Sean, I'll let you have access to my data, but you need to include me as an author on the publication, even though I'm not going to have anything to do with the project or the paper. So it's a quid quo pro kind of scenario. Guest would be putting somebody on a paper, trying to increase your odds of it getting accepted. You see this is a common thing, or this is a thing that happens with research proposals. You put some big name person who's been successful at grants, you just put them on there just so that you can ride their coattails and get something or increase the odds of something getting accepted. And then the last would be ghost authorship, in which one person writes for another person. And this could be either, kind of without pay, or even pay scenarios where you're actually purchasing someone to write something for you. So those are kind of obvious things. And then also denial of authorship. I said, to be an author, you should have participation in the project and in the paper. And so we have to be careful as faculty when graduate students are working with us while they're here at the university. They graduate and maybe they did a project, but we never got around to publishing it. I owe that student the right of first refusal before I just go publish out from underneath them, right? That's just collegial. That's just good practice. And so, this happens, but I'll also say this does not mean that faculty or a student needs to be held hostage by a person who is non-responsive. So as a faculty member, as a practice, if I had a graduate student working on a project and then they left, successfully or not, if they worked on that project, I should give them the right of first refusal on being a co-author. Now, I don't have to wait ad nauseum or wait forever for them. I mean, I could say, I need a response in a couple of weeks because I need to get working on this, and I need you to let your yes be yes or your no be no, either get in or get out. But I'm not going to wait forever. Same thing the other direction. When a graduate student leaves Purdue and they're like publishing on their thesis or dissertation, for example, it's typical that a faculty member would be included as a co-author, because usually we're involved in the research or we're involved in editing and so forth of the publication. And so the graduate student should give right of first refusal to a faculty member about whether they're going to be a co-author or not. But similarly, they shouldn't be held hostage by the faculty member if they give them a reasonable amount of time to respond, right? So these kind of things work together in that way, but that's where I see it play out a lot with graduate students and with faculty. And, it's something that I see.
Another question came up in the chat, Jamie, about if I present my research at a conference and I have a poster, and somebody comes up and swipes my methods, and then I see it published in a journal, how is that viewed?
And so it could, if there's any. It could very well be plagiarism, even though it's not like a word match plagiarism kind of thing. That's, when words match exactly and we can find that, that's easy to identify plagiarism. The harder one is when somebody pilfers your idea. But certainly it could vary that. Just at first glance, I'd say that's probably research misconduct. If you've came up with a new methodology or a new finding, if you've come up with a finding, a poster, somebody comes by, talks to you about it, and then they publish a paper on it on the heels of you doing it, and don't give you any credit or citation for the original idea or findings, certainly that would be plagiarism. Even though it's not word for word plagiarism, you're pilfering an idea, and that falls under the guise of plagiarism. Now, there's obviously some gray in there. There could be ideas that are so close that, there is some gray in there, but at first glance, I would say that's probably true. And I'll say this also happens oftentimes with peer review. Basically, we as peer reviewers, we have access to information that other people don't have, and so an unscrupulous or unscrupulous individual can pilfer ideas from a peer review process and then subvert or undercut. And again, that would also be research misconduct, and could be reported to the peer review organization or whoever's conducting the peer review. Second one, I'm not going to spend much time on this, the breach of duty care. This has to do with just simply executing the requirements relative to research protocols, right? Just following good protocol, good procedure relative to the research that we conduct. Most of this stuff would go to like the EVPRP, like the IRB or the PIA Cook for review if it had happened, if it happened. The very last one, improper conduct of peer reviews, this is kind of what I was talking about just a minute ago. Oftentimes, if I get a greeting card from one of the federal sponsors, and I say that tongue in cheek, a greeting card from one of the federal sponsors is, hey, you need to take a look at this and an investigation is probable. A lot of times there have been situations where they'll actually say, we also believe that there's a breach of peer review or confidentiality here, and we would like your investigation committee to actually give us their professional opinion about whether they believe that happened or not. So oftentimes these federal sponsors can add some stuff on top of that the investigation committees have to deal with. So it is, now I will say it's a lot of times it's hard for this to come to the forefront because it usually takes a reviewer connecting lots of dots to be able to see it. So peer review doesn't catch a lot of stuff, but over time, a person gets away with it enough times, they get conditioned to do it over and over again, and eventually they trip themselves up. Somebody eventually notices it. So improper dealings with allegations, this is really on the institution and on the research integrity office that, if we don't address research misconduct according to our policy, or on the backside, if somebody's providing, we believe all allegations are provided in good faith. If somebody's just doing it to be malicious, then we as an institution have to do something about it. So reporting DRPs, detrimental research practices, the best place to report it would be the graduate school first. Now it's kind of odd because I have a foot in both places, right? Kind of like Pete Dunn used to have a foot in both places too. And I think there's an advantage to that of having a foot in the graduate space as well as the research space. But that would be the first place. Then you can also toss it over to research integrity. I mean, obviously we're all communicating across these compliance offices a lot to ensure these things get dealt with. So let me stop and see if there are any questions.
I've given everybody the opportunity to unmute if you want and ask, or in the chat. We'll try to manage the chat. I can't see you, so if you raise your hand, I won't see that. So just the way my screen's set up. There was another question in the chat here about statute of limitations on things that happen, and maybe it's relative to sending something forward for publication or whatever. Is there any kind of number, within a certain number of years when things apply back to some of these issues?
That's a great question. Certainly there is a Purdue's policy is 6 years. So that's but I will say there have been exceptions made to that in certain cases. For example, if a federal sponsor, let's say, noticed an anomaly that was greater than 6 years old, we would be expected to take care of that. There are other situations that might arise where we might go, but it would not be typical, right? Okay, well, if that's okay, I'll go ahead and continue. So this next topic is actually a really hard one to talk about. And I've been trying to craft how to talk about it for quite some time. Well, at least for the last probably 2 years as I started talking about it. The issue goes all the way back to Bush Jr., but it has come to the fore as of 2018, which really started with a NIH Dear Colleague letter addressing the concern about undue foreign influence. And so it's the difficulty is talking about this topic is, as faculty and as researchers, we collaborate and we have this idea of open collaboration, open communication, and those kinds of things. And so to have to think or be concerned about the potential of people taking intellectual property from the research that we create and then trying to capitalize it outside the United States. These two things are at odds, but it's a reality, and it's a reality that's continuing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but let's just kind of define it first. So undue foreign influence is basically the use of the academic research enterprise to compromise U.S. economic competitiveness and national security. Like I said, this has bipartisan roots all the way back to the early 2000s. And, to show you that it's continuing, I mean, there's a Strategic Competition Act of 2021. It's basically proposed legislation that's under review right now. Matter of fact, I had gotten a press release or a news release or article on it like Monday. So this is a very contemporary topic. Even There was a news summary that came out about Biden's funding plans and appropriation plans for the various federal agencies. And within it, there was a note where he said, or I assume it's he, but his administration was going to continue with the work that had started under the prior administration and under, so this work is continuing. So what do we mean practically? There are basically four things. First would be peer review violations. So serving as a peer reviewer, particularly for grant agencies, pilfering ideas, and then feeding those to entities outside the United States for basically monetization and or competitive advantage and those kinds of things. Second would be failure to disclose substantial foreign resources. This could be employment relationships or employment arrangements. It could be foreign support, and some is direct and some is kind of indirect. And what I mean by that is like money is kind of like obvious, right? If you're getting funding from another country or another a place outside the United States. But even people, when you talk about a particular country being willing to fund visiting scholars to come and they're dedicated to you and get to work on your research, it's basically a free resource for you. That's being funded by an external agency. And oftentimes those things come with hooks on the individual who is actually benefiting from it, right? So a person may get funded by their country to come and do research here, but there's unbeknownst to us, oftentimes as researchers, they may be under contract to say that they have to provide any and all information they are able to garner back to that home institution who's funding them. So they're here kind of not as direct, kind of indirect actors gathering information that can then be used by foreign agents. So foreign grants, and then lastly, talent awards. These are probably the most overt, I would say, and have gotten the most attention, probably the most well-known. And again, I would say I hate saying specific things or specific countries, and I want to separate governments from people. Right. A lot of times the people in a country are not the government that we're talking about. And I'm talking about government actors here, government aims. But the most well-known talent program is the 1,000 Talents program coming out of China. Again, don't believe what I have to say. Go read it for yourself. Just do undue foreign influence or look up 1,000 Talents program and read for yourself. But that's number two. Number three would be failure to disclose significant foreign financial conflicts of interest, like equity in foreign countries, that kind of thing. And then lastly would be kind of failing to abide by U.S. export control laws, both ITAR and, I just lost the other one, ITAR and, it'll come to me later, probably at a point where it's not relevant. So those are the four specific things. So what do I think is our response as faculty and so forth? Just being aware, because I don't think we think about this as faculty. I mean, we're all about collaborations and working together with people, not distrusting people. And it's sad that we would actually have to be that way. But so to me, these things are tension. And we also have to make sure that we're not being biased or discriminatory in our practices too. Meaning, like, if I've got a project that is export control, or, I can't put out a call for hiring graduate students, but you have to be a US citizen. That can lead to discriminatory hiring practices. So awareness, being aware when we travel, being aware of security of our materials, our intellectual property and our collaborations, communicating, talking about this as best we can. It's a really hard topic to talk about. So we have to kind of craft that carefully in the way that we talk. And I will tell you, not that everybody wants to do more city training, but there are a couple optional modules in the online city certification training that they're not required as part of what we do as faculty. But I would encourage, if it gives some really good suggestions on how to address and address this issue. Compliance, and this is the biggest area for us as faculty, is that all of the grant agencies are dealing with this differently. Now, the appropriations, I'm hoping that by like 2022, as the appropriations for various federal sponsors start coming out, there'll be some coordination. But right now it's the Wild West. Every entity is doing something different. NIH was early to the game and really set some things out to begin with, and NSF followed. DOD, DOE, they kind of approach it in their way. NASA has specific statements against specific countries. And then as far as I know, I've not heard anything from the USDA. And I've, actually tried to find to see if they have any kinds of statements. And since I'm talking to faculty in the College of Agriculture, if you're aware of those, I'd be very keen on gathering some information, just to kind of know where they're at. But nevertheless, realize that there's these shifting grant responsibilities. And essentially what's happening is most of the paperwork that we have to file to go after grants, there's more and more compliance and reporting requirements. And thankfully, we have sponsored program services, which does a pretty good job on the pre-award side. I think institutionally we're lacking on the back end of that. That is the reporting and but we're good on the front end. But just being aware of these compliance issues and just keeping tabs on it. And then lastly, being transparent, that is disclose all support and consulting activities. Just leave nothing to question. I mean, I'll just leave it there. I'll just stop there. So questions on, I think that's the last slide on this particular topic, but questions on this particular topic.
So Jamie, one of the things you might mention is that when we do have visitors to campus, international visitors, we do have a process to go through to vet those visitors. And one of the first steps in our college is to connect with our Office of International Programs in Agriculture, and they will help us through that process. And basically, we explore everybody that's invited to visit campus. In case they are a potential bad actor, and they will be flagged, and then it will influence their ability to come to campus or not. So just be aware that that's out there for the university, and it's something that we engage all the time.
And I pulled up while you were talking, I pulled up the chat. I see there was a question about a situation where a reviewer had rejected a work for publication, and then there's a we suspect, or there was the person was suspected of basically taking that idea and then publishing it. And so the question is what kind of misconduct it is and what do you do? First and foremost, it's a breach of reviewer confidentiality. And so I'd certainly bring that issue up to whoever the editor is for that publication. The degree to which, if the ideas presented in that submission had been published in some form that you could point to and say, hey, that's plagiarism of idea, that would give you extra credence or extra oomph to be able to make it a research misconduct claim. But oftentimes the sad thing is peer reviewer confidentiality, when it is sacrificed, unless you have other publications elsewhere that you can point to about it being research misconduct, about the only thing you can point to is reviewer breach of confidentiality, right? So it would depend on what other things you might be able to point to as far as theft of ideas. You could also, I guess just thinking out loud, one option would be to contact whatever institution that person is at, contacting their RIO and having conversation.
There was another question here in the chat about explaining what a talent program is. Talk a little bit.
Right. So most talent, I don't know how to say this. All I'm familiar with are the Chinese talent program, and China is very forthright with the technologies and the things that they're going after and that they're interested in. Most talent programs are designed to be something where you are funded to go to that country, or you might be funded in the United States, but basically you are funded via grant, scholarship, or some other mechanism by that foreign entity. And usually there is language in the kind of contractual language about anything you create while you're under that contract, anything you find out or discover, you're supposed to funnel back to the originator of that talent program. And that's why there's a lot of sensitivity. And some of the contracts actually even say you're not even supposed to disclose that you're in the talent program, which, that sets at the outset, that creates a problem if you have to disclose. And that's where you'll see, if you search for talent program in Google, what you're going to find is a lot of high-level researchers. The one that comes to mind, I think his name was Charles Lieber. He was the head of the Department of Chemistry, I think at Harvard, anyway, he had not disclosed that he was being paid by a foreign talent program while being the head of a chemistry department and taking grant funds from the NSF and others. And so that's probably the most recent big case that I'm aware of. Again, his name's Charles Lieber, I think, Lieber. Okay, I was just reading about it this morning because I was actually going through some of the optional modules in City because I wanted to re-review them a little bit. Okay, well, I'll move on then if there are no other questions. Authorship and peer review, I've really kind of chunked this and conflicts of interest. I really kind of narrowed down, so I am really about done talking here. But so authorship, I've already kind of given you, I've already said kind of what the criteria for authorship is. That is, and you can read the language here, but I communicated as material participation in the research, material participation in the paper, which leads to being a final approver. And there are a variety of ways of how you tackle whose name goes first and those kind of things. And there's different practices. I mean, I think the key there is just simply making sure that we let those things be representative of the amount of work, not on other factors, but truly the amount of work that someone has put into whatever it is that's a contribution. I've quoted, and I'm not a medical journal editor. This is a carryover from Pete, but this is probably one of the highest level groups that I'm aware of, and most groups kind of follow this. I've tried to look for kind of some direction from the national academies because I think that's more broad in its. But this is a good basis. It talks about acknowledgement section. This is basically where you could put anybody who didn't meet the qualifications of an author, and just making sure that you have permission for them to be included. There is a thing that's relatively new called the credit taxonomy that a lot of journal editors and conference folk are using when they have authors submitting materials. It's a way for an editor to make sure that anybody that's on the author list actually has some contributorship. So if you look this up, essentially it gives you a list of roles. And then if I were submitting an article that required credit taxonomy to be used, for each author that I list, I would actually have to say what their contribution was to it. And so it gives editors the ability, and even reviewers in some cases, gives them some measure of, to what degree was the person involved. And it makes sure that they don't end up getting situations like gift, guest, and ghost kinds of authors on those kinds of things, because it just reduces that problem. Some authorship issues, I've already talked about some of this. Authorship agreements, Purdue has no authorship policy. This is something that I think is desperately needed because I've had to adjudicate discrepancies or discussions or cuss and discuss between faculty where there are authorship disputes, and even faculty and graduate students. I really think Purdue needs an authorship policy, at least guidelines, and then an adjudication process. And the adjudication process would be faculty judging the case, kind of like what we do in either grade appeals and or other types of due process scenarios where faculty governance comes into play. A lot of Ohio State's probably the kind of on the forefront of this. And if I were to model a policy, I'd probably model it after theirs. And that's kind of what I'm using as a basis, to be honest. Key is knowing that authorship disputes are not misconduct. And the key is, to the degree possible, as faculty work together. If I were to come to any one of you and say, I have this great freelance opportunity, it's going to be a contractual situation. I know you'll make a lot of money. I'm not quite sure what that will be. And you need to do this, basically they're looking for you to do some writing, but I'm really not sure how much that's going to entail. Very few of you would sign without more detail than that, but we enter into author agreements all the time with no more information than that. And so we can't be surprised when things go sideways, and we get into spicy conversations about publications because of mismatched expectations. So to the degree that you can have those conversations up front, I would encourage, to the degree that you can to have those, because I think it removes a lot of the questions and difficulties.
We got a question in the chat about PhD thesis. And, as you mentioned at the outset, in some of the departments in the college, there are a collection of manuscripts that are already published, and so certainly there are pieces of those chapters and those manuscripts that have contributions from other authors. And the question was: is there a standard that the university is going towards in terms of acknowledging that those contributions to those thesis chapters that are already published, the manuscripts?
Great question. So I'm going to put on my associate dean hat, right? Because the thesis dissertation office comes up through me in the grad school. So the grad school, I don't think is not going to prescribe a policy, but I think what we would say is that each unit that allows article-based dissertations needs to have some consistent stance, and you need that stance before there's a cuss and discuss issue on the table that you're trying to resolve. So I just have some kind of policies, things that I've seen, and I've seen folks that are willing to accept a multi-author publication. The key is when it's included in a dissertation is clearly at the outset defining what that candidate's role was in that paper. Because a lot of times we've seen situations where we have two graduate students that are on the same paper, and they both want to use it in their dissertation, and that's not disallowed, but we do need to figure out some way of defining that, what piece or what parts each co-author had to do. So it's really just having some way to document that. I don't think the graduate school would step in and, we want to leave that to units. That's a local thing, I think, but I do think local units need to have a strategy or at least guidelines, if not a policy, so you can kind of respond to it consistently, I think. And Sean, I would say, does the college have any college policy like that, or could you see that happening? I don't know.
We have shared some best practices. It's not a hard, fast policy, but we share best practices in terms of at the beginning of theses and the beginning of chapters, indicating the candidate's role and the supporting role from the other authors. Okay. There's a model there if folks want that. I'm sure.
And I would say I'm not aware of an overarching policy. I think a lot of people are trying to approach it from a guideline standpoint as they see how it kind of fleshes out. Well, my last slide in this section is just kind of authoring concerns. It's really more authoring resources, is probably a better name for this. I just want to make sure that all faculty know that they have access. You have access to a free Overleaf Pro account. Overleaf is basically a Word-like interface for LaTeX. Most people avoid LaTeX like the plague unless you're a programmer, coder, scripter, propeller head, whatever you want to call it. And I consider myself in that band, so please don't get offended by the word propeller head because I'm calling myself that. But nevertheless, Overleaf gives you a WYSIWYG editor for LaTeX, some benefits of LaTeX. You don't have to deal with formatting. Essentially, you can shift from APA to MLA to whatever you want to very easily. If you use a citation editor, as long as it can output a .bib file, you can basically suck those resources or those references into Overleaf. And then you don't have to worry about the reformatting of it as you go from journal to journal, conference to conference, whatever. You can do shared authoring in it. And it also has it's more like thousands of templates for different conferences and organizations, and they're continually doing more. And I've noticed some graduate students are now starting to use this. So they'll create their dissertation in Overleaf and then share it with their committee through Overleaf, because it allows collaborative editing and some things like that. Again, it is free for all graduate faculty and graduate students. And so I give you the link there, and if you can ask me about it too via email and I can get you connected there. So that's one resource to be aware of. Second would be Authenticate. I think most people are aware of this, particularly in the College of Agriculture, since Pete Dunn was kind of the instigator, really the brainchild behind getting this at Purdue. It's a valuable tool, but it is only faculty. Basically, it provides, it's basically a word matching software, kind of like Turnitin or whatever when we've used in Blackboard and or Brightspace. To me, it's more robust, and it's also not connected to a learning management system. If you don't have an account, just send me an email. I'm the one that sets up all the permissions for that, and I'll usually respond and give you kind of I have this little basic instruction set that I provide afterwards. And then the last thing is copyrights. Most faculty are aware that copyrights are not just one thing. They're actually 5 things, right? So the right of first publication, distribution, duplication, derivative rights, and public performance and display. And the key there is making sure that if we're going to do our graduate students, if they're doing article-based dissertations, making sure that when they publish, that they're not giving away derivative rights, because essentially that dissertation is a derivative. If they give those rights away, then you have to go ask the journal or whatever if you can use your own material, which is annoying. Most of them will allow it, but still, why give away the rights? If you don't have to. So there's this thing called the BTAA CIC addendum, Big Ten Academic Alliance addendum. And it's basically a legal form that you can provide to conferences or journals if they're fighting you on allowing you to retain derivative rights in public performance. And you usually have to ask because, as you can imagine, publishers, if they can take all the rights, they will. I mean, that's the game. And so if you can retain derivative rights, public performance display, this is a mechanism to do so. And this is something that I oftentimes talk with graduate students about as they move forward. So I think that is, I got peer review in here too. So there's, I think, one slide on peer review. So I'll wrap this up. So peer review, the key thing is just realizing it's privileged communication, that it's confidential. It's not supposed to be shared with other people. Unless you have prior consent of an editor. And so that's the key thing that I would communicate to faculty is just be careful as you're doing peer review that you're not sharing that with other people. I understand there are situations or times when, maybe it's a Friday and I'm supposed to have a review out on a Monday and I've got a postdoc or a grad student in my office or in my lab and they would have the ability to do the review. The temptation is just to kind of offload it on them and have them do it over the weekend. But that's really not, it's actually illegal from a legal standpoint. So, what would make it legal if I were to go to that editor and say, I'm in a pinch, I got a grad student or a postdoc who's really good and could do the review. Do you mind if I have them do the review so that I can meet the commitment of a deadline? That's kind of the proper way to go about it. Because we really put our postdocs, our students in bad positions if we were to put them in that situation. So that last comment is more for grad students and stuff when I'm talking to them. So let me stop and say the last slide thing is on conflicts of interest, and it's pretty quick, but let me stop and see if there are any questions about authorship and peer review or other comments, because there's lots of knowledge here in the room.
Yeah, Jamie, one of the other things that comes up relative to the confidential peer review, but also wanting to provide an opportunity for graduate students to learn about that process. And some might be tempted to say, okay, let's take this manuscript that I'm a reviewer on, and let's look at it in Journal Club. And again, that is certainly a conflict of confidentiality and in that process. Is there something that you would recommend along those lines that helps in a learning process, and maybe it's that sort of helps students see the review, but also through to the end of the final recommendations and so on before they get in there with their own papers?
And I know, Bob, you're in the College of Agriculture. You also teach Grad 612. I know you probably dealt with this because I'm not real familiar with journal. I could come up with some answer off the fly, but I'd rather have some practical. So Bob, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I have any good suggestions for Sean's question. I know that it is a real issue because I hear about it when I teach Grad 612 of faculty members who basically hand out manuscripts that they've been sent to review to everyone in their lab and say, we're going to discuss this on Friday. And that's obviously not a good way to do anything. In terms of solutions, I think it's hard. You can, if you're doing it on an individual sort of one at a time basis, you can potentially ask the editor, as Jamie mentioned, and get permission for a grad student to be involved in the process. If you want to do it on a larger scale, I think you do it, you don't use something you've been sent to review. You use just a manuscript that's already published in the literature, and you have everybody review that and give them feedback on how well they're performing as reviewers, I guess. I think those are the real solutions. I think the confidentiality is primary here, and it's absolutely critical. The one other thing I was going to add just to Jamie's comments about that is, in the example he gave, you pawn this off on a student or a postdoc, and they do the review for you, and then typically that faculty member might send that in under their own name, and that's of course plagiarism as well. And plagiarism in the review process is scientific misconduct. So, you really don't want to go down that path.
And I don't have anything else to add to that. I think that was well said.
Other comments in questions in the chat? Okay, so we do have one question in there about city training, and I'll just emphasize that here is that there's two parts to the responsible conduct and research. One is the city training, and the other is what we're doing right now, which is the field specific RCR training. And so your city training and your exploration around that is independent of this field specific training. The field specific training is at each stage of your career. So for faculty, this is a 2 hours of field specific training in the course of your faculty career. Same for postdocs, same for graduate students. If a graduate student completes this today and in the fall becomes a postdoc, then there's going to be field specific training. They'll need to repeat that as a postdoc. But to that question of the city training and its expiration in 2023, you're going to need to renew that at a 4-year interval. Initially, I think you did it at a 5-year interval, and we've changed that at the university. It's a 4-year interval. You'll get a notice from the Office of Research, the EVPRP's office, about needing to redo that training.
And I would say there's the only other exception that I'm aware of, and Bob, chime in if you're aware of others, would be, if you're federally supported, or particularly if your graduate students are federally supported or on federal sponsorship, a lot of those sponsors have maybe shorter cycles of requirements, and or maybe even longer than 2 hours may be required if they're supported on, an NSF, NIH. I'm not exactly sure on the on USDA type grants, but that would be the only caveat that I'd put in there, would be, if they're on spot, and again, they're going to get emails from EVPRP if that applies to them for sure, because that has to be regulated even tighter than any of this other stuff, simply because of the requirements to those federal sponsors.
I know Sean's on the Zoom here too. So Sean, if you have some other comments to add in that regard, please do.
Hi, Sean. Thank you. Yeah, as far as those requirements, there are some changes that are taking place at the NSF. There are some proposals that are under review. A House bill was submitted regarding some NSF requirements for in-person training and who gets trained. And I know that there's discussion that the USDA is looking to revamp its policy. So some NEFA changes and some Hatch Grant changes may be coming, but nothing's been put in writing yet. And Sean, you're 100% correct. The city training, the online version, the first component, the lifespan of the training for RCR is now 4 years. It was 5. And it's been realigned to match the federal requirements. And this training, the field specific training, is if you're a student or a postdoc, it's once a degree or once a stage. And if you're faculty, it's once a career. However, I would say this, as new people every year will be trained, if you're partaking in this, your experience and your voice may be invaluable to young people coming up. So if you choose to participate, you'll be more than welcomed, even though your requirement has already been met. So, but that's as far as I know. NSF and NEFA are going to have some changes coming. And you're right about the 4 years and the once a career for field specific at each stage.
Great. Thank you, Sean.
Well, should I finish up with this last segment?
Back to you, Jamie. Yep.
All right. So this is my last segment, and then we can kind of have open discussion and whatever, however we want to proceed from there. But on conflicts of interest, I've kind of listed kind of the classical stuff that we talk about in RCR, but also some other stuff. So big one we have to watch for as faculty are commitments, conflicts of commitment or effort. So as we divvy up our time being bought out by grants, making sure we're watching that, number one. And then as we have students on grants, making sure that when we fill out the certification of effort through I think it's funny how they name these software products, because if they have to give you an affirming name, you probably know the product is probably not that, like Success Factors or Seamless. So Seamless is where we certify effort for our graduate students and stuff. I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but we just have to make sure that when we do certify them, that they are actually on those things. Conflicts of interest, I'm going to leave personal alone. I mean, I think we all understand what that is. Professional would be, prior relationships. And all of this has to do with the threats to our objectivity, perceived or real, right? And a lot of times it's more perception than it is reality. But professional would be those kinds of relations. Financial is one that's very, very, it's a top issue right now, of making sure that you disclose any and all financial interests. Conflicts of conscience, again, I'm going to park that one. I think we all kind of know what that one is. And then I always use this opportunity to just remind everybody about the university's nepotism and amorous relationship policies. And again, all of these have to do with threats to objectivity, either personally assessed or by externally assessed. We have to be aware of it because it could threaten us. And I'll just, I usually use this as an opportunity to not forget the outside activities reporting thing. Usually we get an email as faculty every fall from Melissa Rollick's office asking us to go out and fill that out. I would encourage, a lot of times it's not so much that faculty don't know this, but making sure that graduate students know that this does apply to them. And so they need to be aware of it. I'm not aware of any major situations where the university has said no to something we've put. It's really just documenting these outside activities. I'm sure there's been stuff denied at some point, but generally when I talk about this, it's really just a matter of going on record and saying, hey, I'm doing this in addition to my full-time activity. And I think it protects us, it protects the university from all around. So conflicts of interest, oftentimes, and I think I took the slide out of here, but I'll just finish by saying with conflicts of interest, the main thing is just, first of all, recognizing when there's going to be a conflict of interest. Usually graduate students are like, well, how do I know that? And it's like, to me, it's like, if the thought comes to your mind, I wonder if this is a conflict of interest, it probably is. To me, that's kind of your own conscience telling you. But hopefully we all also have some professional colleague that's close to us that we can bounce ideas off of, and that can actually speak into our life if they think, and know us well enough to know what we're up to and what we're doing. And sometimes colleagues like that can help us. And then second, once you kind of acknowledge that there's a potential conflict of interest, then I think it's a matter of disclosing it. Because oftentimes, even if it's the most, boring thing in the world, if people perceive that we hide it, oftentimes they believe that it was for nefarious reasons that we didn't disclose it in the first place. So it's kind of hard to recover from that. And then the last part after disclosing is, sometimes it requires a management plan. Sometimes it's just throwing it out there so your colleagues, I've served on search committees before, and everybody has, right? But serve on search committees, and a name will pop up that I've either had prior relationship with, as far as professional or otherwise, or maybe it was a prior grad student of mine. And I'll throw it out to the committee and say, hey, I want to recognize that I know this person, so you can filter my comments through the fact that I may be overly biased towards that person. Sometimes it's actually I've recused myself from the committee totally, depending on what the position is. So it's really creating some management plan that maintains objectivity, both real and perceived. So that's kind of my 2 cents on all of these topics, kind of condensed down. And I'm going to turn it over to Sean and or Bob, and I'll kind of remain quiet and let's ask.
So questions from the participants, anything that wasn't covered that you're wondering about? Now's a great time to get that out there. Chances are, if you've got a question, somebody has a very similar question. So you're going to help others by putting your questions in the chat. We had one in the chat about undergraduate students and getting reminders about RCR training. And maybe Sean can help us a bit with this too, is there a certain level of involvement in the research that would require the undergrad to have both parts of RCR training, or is it the policy that we should just assume that the students should have that training across the board? So, and it gets really to whether they're, they could be working and being paid on a USDA grant, for example, but their role might be washing dishes and prepping labeling tubes or something like that, and not directly in generating primary data. So maybe you can speak to that, Sean, a little bit for us.
Certainly. So this is an ongoing, very important topic, identifying undergraduate researchers and properly classifying individuals that should take city training and RCR field specific training. And Sean, you speak to 100% of the truth. In the end of the day, the PI is the individual that knows the best role and definition for undergraduate researchers. We identify typically off of a report that we get from sponsored program services that identifies the undergraduates that are paid from grants. But there are so many avenues by which undergraduates have to get involved in research, such as a class component or just an interest that they want to pursue to see if that is something they'd like to do for graduate school, just a volunteer to build a resume. And so the role is typically defined by the researcher because you have the most hands-on information for them. Now, under the current guise, if you are defined as a researcher, you are required to complete both components, and that would be involved in the conducting of research, the publishing of research, the presenting of research, analyzing, gathering data, normalizing data, all the factors that come into that. But if you are a person that's volunteering in a lab and you truly are just labeling tubes or washing dishes, as Sean said, which we run into in many cases, they go on resumes, but technically they don't meet the definition of a researcher. So we need more information that comes back from the lab to make a true determination on whether or not that specific undergraduate meets the qualifications and the needs to complete the training. We'd love to say to everyone, this is universal training and everyone should do it. But I would never want to ask anyone who does not meet the definition of a person active in research and ongoing research to do undue training just to do it. It's really to embolden the ethics and the integrity discussion. And the earlier we get to undergraduates that are doing research, the greater the opportunity is to have these discussions. And I don't know if there's data out there that shows the efficacy of the RCR programs as avoiding plagiarism, avoiding misconduct, the FFP. Some people say, hey, you learn ways to sidestep it. But let's hope that's not the case, because what we're trying to do is bolster the culture for ethics and integrity and take an environment that's already strong and make it stronger. So the earlier researchers get exposed to this at the undergraduate stage, the greater the hope that we'll give Jamie less business, because he does enough things as it is. But that's really the case. If you're funded, we're going to ask you to do the training. And if your PI identifies you as an active researcher, then yes, you'll be required to take the training. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you are absolutely a researcher because you're present in a lab. There are many questions that need to be asked.
Okay, great. Thanks. That helps tremendously. Other questions in the chat? If not, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to help you, and I'll wait for those questions to come up. But while they're coming, I'm going to share my screen on just how to document the training today and then going forward. There'll be other opportunities for you to gain training either in laboratories or other sessions that are held across the university. So I do have here, and I can add this to the chat, this is the web address for the Responsible Conduct and Research Office in the EVPRP. If you can't find it, I know that I have a lot of these addresses that I can never find. Just go in and Google search. The three words that will get you there is Purdue, EVPRP, and RCR. And if you do that, it takes you to this website. Okay, the Responsible Conduct and Research website has a lot of good information on there, but it talks in general about responsible conduct and research and our obligation as researchers to complete that training. And here you can see listed the two types of training. We're talking today about the field specific RCR training. And then there's lots of information in the FAQs. What you're going to do in terms of tracking today is you're going to go down to the track your RCR training. You're going to click there and you'll see it open up underneath that window the following two things. And so for the RCR field specific training, you're going to go to that line, and then there's a little highlighted text here. So you click on that text, and it will take you to a password enabled screen. And this password is your career count and your username. So it would be your email password, basically. And so your username, password for that gets you, and it's not linked to Boiler Key. So you go in, fill those in, and then click forward. And what you'll see, and this is for mine, what you'll see in the next screen is the following, all about, my research training, my general online RCR training, and my field specific RCR training. You'll see down here information about your appointment and so on, your department. And this is a place where, as Sean mentioned, we may have students in this that are incorrectly identified as researchers. They would go to the screen, they could click that researcher type, and they could update there. And so underneath that, the researcher type, it has the option of not a researcher. So if you feel you're incorrectly identified as a researcher, click that, and then you have no further obligation to do the training. So as you click out of that, then really what we're trying to do next is identify my field specific RCR training. And so if you click that text, it'll take you to that next page, which tells you the number of total hours time required. So as a faculty member, I have 2 hours required. I haven't completed any to date, but I will after this session because I'm going to record this as train time. And then it'll tell how close I am to the 2 hours and so on. To update that RCR trainings, field specific training, I'm going to click right here, and it'll take me to the next screen, which looks like this. And in here, I'm going to fill in my name. It'll be already filled in, my researcher type. A drop-down menu here I'll pick West Lafayette, College of Ag, my home department, and the number of training sessions here. So I filled this in, one training session, there's all my information. I'll go and fill in the details. So if I click that, it pops up a window here. I pick the date off a calendar. I add the duration of time. This is a seminar workshop. I hit submit, and Sean gets that information, and we're good to go. So it's as simple as that. And we're encouraging each of you to go ahead and to provide that information on your own. We're asking you to do that. I'll send out an email that basically walks you through that process. So any questions on that? So I've got a question in the chat. Extension educators are technically staff and not faculty. What category would you suggest? So go back to that, and there should be, Sean, I think there's a staff category in there. I gotta go back and look.
They may want to consider selecting research associate, because that covers pretty much everyone defined at the professional stage with an umbrella term, research associate.
Okay. So other questions, comments in the chat? Yes, today is part of that 2-hour training. Looking through the chat here.
How many, from a duration perspective, how long should everyone participating today select? Is it an hour and a half? Is it 2 hours? What should they select?
Well, we're going to be about an hour and a half by the time we're complete here. So we'll still have a balance of a half an hour somewhere.
So they should put in for the duration 1.5, because that'll give you 1 hour, and the 0.5 will give you the half. So that hopefully that alleviates some of the concern about how to credit yourself. It'd be 1.5, so it'd be an hour and a half.
Yeah. So other ways you can get that training is that if you have a staff meeting, and you're talking about, about these areas that we've kind of touched on today, research and research integrity, that counts. Even if it's in 15-minute increments over the next year, you just add those in. So go back and, okay, we had a staff meeting on May 5th, and we talked about data and securing data and making sure that, there was data integrity. We spent 15 minutes on it. I go in and I add that in. As a graduate student, if you have a lab meeting or meeting with your advisor and you're talking about authorship, you tell you, okay, we've got a paper coming up. Where should I be as a graduate student in terms of the list of authors? Where should you be as a faculty member in terms of that? Should we include Sean Courtney on this paper? He gave us some advice, but he wasn't involved in the data or reading the manuscript. I mean, those are discussions that you're going to have, and that constitutes it too. So you can easily get that other 15 minutes, half an hour that you need to put in here. Other things for graduate students, many of our departments have either an orientation session or a requirement for grad 612. So the time that you spend in discussion in 612 as a course counts towards this 2 hours of training. So it's not just at sessions like this. It can be at any event that has a discussion around and some direction around responsible conduct and research. Another question in the chat about Office of the State Chemist staff. How should they identify? So maybe Sean, you can help me there. They're a state organization that's doing analysis on a per fee basis to help our industry.
Right. And because there is the collaboration with Purdue, I think it's role specific. The majority of people that I've been dealing with from offices at this level have identified themselves as research associates and not a faculty level commitment at Purdue. Please feel free to use the research associate level. You'll be credited absolutely for that. It's not a slight in any way. It's just depends on the role that gets described back to me. For the most part, it's research associate.
So I see some other things in the chat, some incorrect things where I put the wrong month and date. Is there possible to go back in and correct some of these after the fact, Sean, or is this something that, there is, we can open?
Sure, there's an ongoing discussion right now about revamping some of the controls that are in the research training online application, because we have multiple entries put in. A person can self-report, some departmental people can self-report. I can get a list and then follow it up. So you may have different dates, you may have different topics. For example, there are some people that consider this an RCR course, but Sean properly classified it as a seminar and a workshop. And so we're developing a way to clean up the database. It just takes a little bit of time to do the coding and to do the testing on it, but we will be cleaning up the database and it'll be coming very soon.
Other questions? Okay. Question in the chat too about what were the 3 keywords. I just put in RCR, EVPRP, and Purdue, and it's the first hit that comes up.
And also, Sean, just to let everyone know, when you do email EVPRP using the RCR training at purdue.edu, I'm the person who directly responds, and I do my very best to answer every single email. So I just want you to know that the communications that come into the office are taken seriously, and I answer each one of them. So it'll be me that you communicate with. So I'm here to help.
Some others is if we have another 30-minute session amongst our staff, whatever, do I just go in and update today, or do I add it as a new event? I'd suggest you add it as a new event, and it'll sum the 2 of them together to give you the 2 hours that's required. Do you need to sign anything else from the training today? No, not from us, but you need to go to the site and document the fact that you've been here today and done this and participated in the workshop. So it's up to you to go and document the training that you've had. We've got a question about logging into the system. We can try to sort those out. It should be your username and whatever password you use for your email address.
Sean, one other thing that may be happening, because we've been running into this, is people are trying to report field-specific training, which is the second component of RCR, without completing the first component, the online RCR in city. So if there is an issue where you are having a login problem, I may have to look into each individual record. So please feel free to email me at rcrtraining@purdue.edu. And if there is an issue where there's an access problem, I can work with our programmer to clear that. And if it's a training issue where you need to complete a course prior to reporting your field specific training, I can update you on that as well. So please feel free to email.
Thanks, Sean. Perfect. Another comment, is this field specific RCR core? Is this the field specific RCR course? It is, but it can be classified under a workshop seminar. So that's one of the items on the drop down menu. Okay. I think we're slowing down in the chat. So, okay. All right. If we don't have any additional questions, then we'll bring our presentation to a close here today. Thank you so much for your participation. And if you've got questions, you can direct them to me. If you've got other more specific questions that I can't answer, I'm going to direct them to Sean. And, you know, we're both here to help get this accomplished. So again, we're not trying to make this difficult for folks. We do have an obligation across the university to provide training. And so we're working together to try to make that happen in all the ways that we can. So really appreciate your attendance here today. Thank you, Jamie, tremendously for your help, for Bob, for your insight, Sean, for your for being here and helping us with this. And again, to everybody, thanks for participating. We'll sign off for today, and thanks so much again. Okay. Bye-bye.